The first thing I knew was that I was warm, and that was how I understood I was meant to be dead. Warmth was a thing for the living, for men by their own hearths with their own wives, and I had none of those things and had not had them in a long time. I was the Alpha King of Ashkar, and for 3 years I had known cold, the cold of the war camp, the cold of the fords in autumn, the cold that lives in a man who has sent too many wolves into the water and watched too few come back. So when I woke to warmth on my face and a fire cracking somewhere near, my first thought was not relief, it was suspicion. My second thought, arriving slow through a skull that felt split down the middle, was that I could not remember dying, and I had been so certain I was going to. I remembered the river. I remembered the crossing at Harrow Ford gone wrong, the Dern arrows coming out of the mist like a black rain, my wolves screaming, the water rising brown and furious with the autumn floods until it was not a ford at all but a drowning thing that swallowed men whole. I remembered being struck, a blow to the side, an arrow or a blade, I never knew which, and the current taking me, rolling me under, the weight of my own war mail dragging me down while the shore lights spun away small and gold and gone. I remembered thinking, with the strange calm that comes at the end, that a king ought to die better than this, face down in a river with no one to see. And then the river took the thought too. Now I was warm, and I was breathing, and my chest ached with the deep, raw ache of a man who has been made to breathe when his body had already given up the argument. I opened my eyes. A low stone room, a fire in a rough hearth banked and tended, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the beams, and the smell of them, wood smoke and river damp, and something green and bitter that had been pressed into the wound at my side. A single window with a sacking curtain and gray light behind it, the flat gray of a flooded valley at dawn. And a woman at the hearth with her back to me, stirring something in an iron pot, her sleeves pushed up and her dark hair bound back with a strip of cloth, humming so low it was almost only breath. I did not know her. And my wolf, which had not been quiet since the war began, which had lived for 3 years as a snarling coal behind my ribs, all teeth and grief and the need to kill whatever had killed ours, my wolf lay down. I cannot tell it any plainer than that. For 3 years he had not slept. He had driven me across every ford and battlefield in the valley with a hunger nothing filled. And now, in a stranger's cottage that smelled of crushed herbs, at the sound of a woman humming over a pot, he simply lowered himself and went still, the way an old dog will circle and settle by a fire it has finally found. The silence of it was so total that for a moment I thought the blow to my head had killed him, and grief lanced through me. And then I felt him there, whole, only quiet, only resting, as if he had been carried a very long way and set down at last exactly where he was meant to be. I made a sound I did not mean to. It was only the pain moving. She turned. I have led wolves into 3 winters of war. I have stood in the breach at Carrow when the shield line broke and held it with my own body until the reserve came up. I have looked into the faces of men who meant to kill me and not moved. I tell you this so you understand what it means when I say that a river widow turning from a cook pot in a one-room cottage was the thing that undid me. She was not a beauty in the way the court would have named it. Her hands were red and chapped from cold water. There was a burn scar old and pale along one forearm and a weariness around her eyes that no young woman should have carried. Her dress was patched at the elbows and dark with damp at the hem. And she looked at me, a huge, battered stranger sprawled in her only bed, a man twice her weight who could have broken her without trying, and she was not afraid. She was only steady, the way the ford stones are steady under a flood. She had a ladle in one hand, and she set it down without hurry. "You're awake," she said. "Good, I thought you might not be. You had the whole river in your lungs when I pulled you out. Don't sit up." I sat up, or I began to. The room tilted, and the wound in my side tore a line of white fire through me, and I went back down against the straw. And she was there before I fell, one hand flat on my chest, pressing me down with a firmness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with knowing exactly what she was doing. "I told you not to," she said, not unkindly. "You've a hole in your side I've spent 2 days closing. Tear it and you'll die in my bed after all my trouble, and then I'll have hauled a drowned man half a mile up a flooded bank for nothing." Her hand on my chest. That was the first time she touched me while I was awake to feel it, and my wolf pressed up into it like a beast leaning into a hand it trusts. The warmth I had woken to was not the fire. It was this, a warmth banked low and steady behind the ribs, in the place where for 3 years there had been only the cold coal of the war. I did not have a name for it then. I only knew that when she took her hand away to fetch me water, The cold came rushing back in, and I wanted her hand returned more than I had wanted anything in a long time. "You pulled me out," I said. My voice was a ruin. "Of the morrow." "Out of the reeds below the ford," she said, holding a cup to my mouth, tipping it slow. "You'd fetched up in the drowned willows where the current lets things go. I saw the mail catch the light. I thought you were dead. You mostly were. The water was over the banks. The whole village fled it. I remembered that much. The villages of the ford abandoned before the battle, the people driven off by the coming armies and the coming flood both. Why were you not gone with them?" She was quiet a moment. She set the cup down. "Someone has to be here," she said, "when the river gives men back." Her name was Nessa. I learned that much the first day and little more because she did not talk to fill silence and I did not have the breath to press. I learned the rest the way you learn a country in the dark, a step at a time, by touch. I learned that the cottage was hers, that it stood alone on a rise above Harrow Ford where the old track met the water, and that it had not flooded because whoever built it, generations back, had built it wise and high. I learned that the village below had emptied when the armies came, folk carrying what they could to kin in the hills, and that she had let them go and stayed. I learned that she had a goat, and 3 hens that had somehow survived the flood on the roof of the byre, and a store of roots and dried fish and river herbs that she rationed like a quartermaster. I learned that she rose before light and slept after dark, and that in between she worked, mending, hauling water up from the well because the river was foul with the flood, tending me, tending the small, hard business of staying alive alone in a drowned valley with a war washing back and forth across it. And I learned, on the second day, that I was not the only one she had pulled from the water. There was a man in the byre. A younger man, feverish, his legs splinted and bound. She went to him at dusk with broth and clean cloths, and I heard her low voice through the wall, steady, and even the same voice she used with me. When she came back and she found me half risen again, one hand braced against the wall, my wolf up and bristling for the first time since I'd woken, because I had caught the man's scent through the byre door, and it was a Dern scent, a River Clan scent, the scent of the enemy I had spent 3 years learning to kill. "He's Dern," I said. "He's a boy with a broken leg and a fever," she said. She set down her basket. "The river doesn't ask a man's clan before it drowns him, neither do I when I fish him out. They're the reason your ford is a graveyard. They're the reason—" I stopped. I had been about to say they're the reason I am bleeding in your bed, and I could not, because I had not told her who I was. To her, I was a wounded northern soldier, one of Ashkar's men, no more. If I named the war as mine, she would begin to ask which man I was in it, and something in me, some cowardice I had never owned before and could not explain, did not want to see the steadiness go out of her face when she learned that the man she had bled 2 days to save was the Alpha King whose war had drowned her valley. "They're the reason for a great deal," she agreed, quiet. "So are yours. I've pulled both out of that river all autumn. I've buried the ones I couldn't save on the high ground behind the byre, Dern and Ashkar both, side by side, because the ground doesn't care either and I've no strength to dig 2 graveyards. She looked at me, and there was no anger in it, only a tiredness that went down to the bone. "You can hate him if you like. It won't change that he's mine to keep alive now, the same as you are. I don't choose which ones the river gives me. I just don't let them go back to it." I lay down. I did not have an answer. In 3 years of war, I had heard a great many speeches about the war from my council, from my captains, from the Dern heralds who came under gray flags to trade threats. Not one of them had ever said a thing as true as "I don't let them go back to it." And it shamed me that a river widow with red hands had found the truth of the thing that all my crowns and councils had missed. That night when she thought I slept, I heard her go out to the graves behind the byre. I heard her speaking, too low for words, the way a person speaks to the dead. And I understood without being told that some of those graves were older than this autumn, that she had been giving the river's dead back to the ground for longer than this war had been mine. By the 4th day I could stand. By the 6th I could cross the room without the wall, and I made myself useful in the small ways a healing man can, mending the byre door she could not lift alone, splitting the wet wood so it would dry, holding the Dern boy's shoulders while she set the leg straighter and he wept and cursed her in his river tongue, and then, when the pain passed, thanked her in it. She did not understand his words. She understood the sound of them well enough. And in those days I watched her, and my wolf watched her, and the thing that had lain down inside me the first hour did not get up again. It grew. It put down roots. I watched her wade out at gray dawn into the shallows where the flood had begun to fall, a long hooked pole in her hands, searching the drowned willows for what the river had brought in the night. Because that was her work, I understood now, the work no one had asked her to do and no one would ever thank her for. Most mornings the river gave her nothing but wrack, and one morning it gave her a drowned ewe, and once, terribly, a man passed all saving, and she brought him up the bank alone, a dead stranger heavier than herself, and carried him to the high ground and dug, and did not weep, because she had used those tears years ago and had learned to do the work without them. I watched her feed the wolves. They came at dusk, the strays, the broken ones, the wolves of the shattered companies that had lost their men or their packs to the war and gone feral and masterless in the drowned valley. A wolf that has lost its bond is a dangerous, grieving thing. My own captains put such wolves down when they found them, for their own mercy and the safety of the camp. Nessa did not put them down. She set out what she could spare at the edge of the light, a handful of scraps, a bone, the offal of a hare, and she stood in the doorway with her arms folded and let them come, and she talked to them low and even in the dark, and they let her. They came to her hand. A gray bitch with a torn ear and the mad grief light in her eyes, that would have taken a soldier's arm off, lay down at Nessa's feet on the 7th evening and put her head against the widow's ankle and shuddered, and was, for a moment, not mad. I stood in the door behind her, and I could not speak. "You'll draw the whole broken army to your door," I managed at last. "They're not the army anymore," she said, watching the gray bitch. "They're just lost. There's a difference, though the men who make wars forget it." She crouched slow and laid her red, chapped hand flat on the gray bitch's head, and the wolf leaned into it the way my wolf had leaned into her hand on my chest, and I understood at last what she was. Not a beauty, not a lady, not anything the court had a word for. She was the thing the war had been taking from all of us, one wolf and one man at a time, and could not take from her. She was mercy that did not require you to deserve it. She gave it to derned boys and drowned strangers and mad, grieving wolves, and to me, and she asked nothing back, and she did not even seem to know that it was rare. My wolf, who had chosen no one in all his years, who had turned his face from every highborn Luna, and every alliance match my council had ever paraded before me until the court had given up and named me a king who would die mateless, my wolf had chosen. He had chosen a river widow with a burned scar and red hands the first hour, before I woke, while she still had her hands in my wound keeping me alive. He had lain down inside me and would not rise from her, and I knew, standing in her doorway watching her gentle a mad wolf out of its grief, that I was hers, that I had been hers since the reeds, that whatever a king was, whatever a war was, they had both become, without my leave, smaller things than this. And I still had not told her my name. I should have told her. I know that now. Every day I did not tell her, the lie grew heavier and hers grew lighter because she had never lied at all. She had simply believed the plain thing, that I was one more soldier the river had spat up, and I had let her. I told myself it was for her safety, and that was not wholly a lie. A widow found sheltering the Alpha King of Ashgar, half a mile from a Dern line, was a widow the Dern would burn out of her cottage, and worse, if they knew. And a widow found sheltering a Dern boy in her byre was a widow my own men would question hard if they knew. She was safest not knowing what she harbored, I told myself. But under that truth was the coward's truth, and I am done lying about it, even to myself. The coward's truth was that in her cottage I was not the king. I was Torin, only Torin, a man mending, a man splitting wood and holding a frightened boy's shoulders and being handed a cup of broth by a woman who did not bow to me, did not fear me, did not want a single thing from me but that I not tear my stitches and not go back to the river. In 3 years no one had looked at me and seen a man. They saw the crown, the war, the thing they needed me to be. She saw a stranger she'd pulled from a flood, and she was gentle with him, and I could not bear to give it up. So I did not, and the lie grew, and the war does not wait for a king to finish healing. On the 9th day, near dusk, the gray bitch at the door came up snarling with her hackles high, and my wolf came up with her, and I knew before I heard the horses what was coming. "Riders," I said, "from the north track, Ashgar." Nessa went to the window. Her face, when she turned back, had changed, not with fear for herself. I think she had spent her fear years ago, but with the swift, hard calculation of a woman who has a Dern boy in her byre and a wounded northerner in her house and armed men riding down on both. How many? A patrol, 6, maybe 8. I was already moving, though the wound pulled. Get to the byre, bar it, whatever you hear, do not come out. They're your own men, why would I? Nessa, I took her by the shoulders. It was the first time I had touched her, and even then, even with riders on the track and the war crashing back through the door, my wolf sang under my hands like a struck bell, and I saw her feel it. I saw something cross her face, some question, some recognition she had no frame for. Do as I ask. Please trust me one more hour. She looked at me a long moment, then she went to the byre. I met the patrol in the yard. They came down the track hard, mud to the horses' knees, 8 of them in Ashkar gray, and at their head, I knew the set of those shoulders half a field off was Havard, my war second, my oldest wolf, a man who had stood at my back since before I was crowned and who had, I saw as he came, the ruined face of a man who has spent 9 days believing his king dead and drowned. He reined up so hard his horse near went down. He stared at me. And then this iron old warrior, who had wept at nothing in 40 years, put his hand over his mouth like a boy. Torin, he said, not my title, my name, and it broke on him. We dragged the morrow for you. We burned no fires. The council's already fighting over the succession. They think you're... He could not finish. He swung down off the horse and crossed the mud and gripped my arms, and behind him 7 men of my guard went to one knee in the flooded yard, heads bowed, and the byre door was open a crack, and Nessa was standing in it. She had not stayed inside. Of course she had not. She was a woman who waded into floods. A barred door was never going to hold her while men she did not know surrounded the stranger she'd saved. She stood in the byre door with the splitting axe in her hand, ready, I think, to defend me, against my own guard. And she watched 8 armed men of Ashkar kneel in the mud to the wounded northern soldier she had pulled half dead from the reeds. She watched her oldest and gravest visitor grip his arms and weep and call him by a name, and then, rising, call him by the other name, the one that changed everything. My king, Havard said, stepping back, dropping to his own knee at last. Thank the moon, my king, you're alive. I turned to her. I will remember her face in that byre doorway until I die. I had braced for the fear to come into it, the fear I had been such a coward to spare myself, the sudden dread of a small woman who has just learned the huge battered man asleep in her only bed for 9 days was the king whose war drowned her valley and killed the men in her graveyard. I had earned that fear. I stood in the mud and waited to be justly afraid of. But Nessa did not look afraid. She looked for one moment only tired, a deeper tiredness than the flood work, the tiredness of a woman who has just understood that even here, even in her own high cottage above her own drowned ford, the world was still the same world it had always been, full of kings and wars and men who were never only men. And then, worse than fear, she looked at me the way you look at someone who has lied to you. Quiet, steady, betrayed in a way too old and too calm to shout about. She set the axe down against the byre wall. She stepped back into the shadow, and she shut the door. You'll want a healer for that side, Havard was saying. There's a wagon 2 hours back. We can have you in the camp by. No. He stopped. The guard glanced up. A king does not say no to being carried out of an enemy valley to safety. It is not a thing that has a place in the order of the world they served. My king, Havard said carefully, the Dern are a half-league east. This ford is not held. Every hour you're here. I know exactly how many hours I've been here, Havard. 9 of them. I know precisely whose hands closed this wound and whose broth I've been living on and whose bed I've been lying in while you dragged the river for my corpse. My voice was doing something I did not recognize. The woman in that byre pulled me out of the morrow with her own hands when the whole valley had fled and left me to drown. She did not know me. She saved me anyway. She's been saving both sides of my war all autumn out of that cottage, one wolf and one boy at a time, and asking nothing, and burying the ones she couldn't save on her own high ground because no one else would. And I repaid her by lying to her for 9 days about who I was, because I was a coward who liked being a man in her house better than being a king in my own. I looked at the shut byre door. I am not leaving until I have set that right. Post a watch. Send the wagon back for a proper healer. And do not let a single one of you frighten her. Havard looked at me a long moment. Something moved in his old face. He had known me since I was a boy who thought war was glory, and had stood beside me through the years the war taught me otherwise, and I think in that moment he saw a thing he had given up hope of seeing. There's a Dern scent in that byre, he said quietly. It was not a question. A boy with a broken leg, under her protection, which is to say, under mine. If any wolf of Ashkar so much as bears a tooth at him, he answers to me. Is that heard? It's heard, my king, Havard said, and I saw the corner of his mouth move, the ghost of the grim humor we'd shared across 3 years of graves. The council will lose what little mind it has left. The council can lose it, post the watch. I went to the buyer. She was inside with the Dern boy, changing his dressing by the light of a single tallow stub, her hands as steady on him as they had ever been, though I saw the tightness in her shoulders that told me she'd heard every word. I stood in the doorway. I did not go in. A man does not walk uninvited into the room of a woman he has wronged, king or no king. Nessa, you should sit, she said, not turning. You'll tear the side you've made me so twice now, your grace. The title was a blade laid flat. She did not raise her voice. She never did. Torin, I said. My name is Torin, that was true. Everything I told you about myself was true. I only left out the one thing, and I've no defense for it worth the breath, so I won't offer one. I'm sorry. Not for surviving, you gave me that, and I'll not insult it by wishing it undone. I'm sorry I let you believe a smaller thing so that I could keep being it. You deserved the truth from the first hour, and you didn't get it, because the truth was that in your cottage I got to be a man for the first time in 3 years, and I was too much a coward to give that up. That's the whole of it. It's an ugly thing, and it's yours to do with as you like. She finished the boy's dressing. She tied it off. She sat back on her heels, and for a while she did not speak, and I let the silence be, because I had filled enough of the last 9 days with a lie, and I would not fill this with excuses. My husband died in your war, she said at last, quiet, not an accusation. A fact she was setting down between us so I would have to look at it. Bram, 2 autumns ago at the first ford crossing, they never gave me the body. I always thought if I stayed by the river, if I pulled the drowned ones out and gave them back to the ground, I always thought maybe someone downstream was doing the same for him. Somewhere. That some woman I'll never meet dug him a grave and said a word over him because I couldn't. It's why I stay. It's the only prayer I've got left, and it's not even for the moon, it's for a stranger, that she's out there, doing for mine what I do for the ones the river gives me. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were dry, and that was worse than weeping. And you're the king who made that river a place where men drown. That's who I've been keeping alive. That's whose broth I've been sharing. So you'll forgive me if I need a moment, Torin, with the truth you've finally seen fit to give me. I had commanded armies. I had faced the Dern heralds and given no ground. I stood in the byre door of a river widow, and I had nothing, no crown, no war, no word, that could stand against the plain size of what she had just said. So I did the only thing left to a man who has run out of everything but the truth. I went to my knee in the byre straw. Me, the Alpha King of Ashgar, before a widow with red hands and a tallow stub. Then hear the rest of the truth, I said. I have fought this war 3 years because I believed it could not be stopped, that the Dern would never yield the fords and Ashgar could never give them up, and so the river would keep drowning men until one side had no men left to drown. I believed that the way I believe the sun rises. I stopped looking for another road because I was sure there wasn't one. I looked at the shut door beyond which my guard knelt, at the wall beyond which lay a graveyard of both our dead in one ground. And then a woman who owes this war nothing but grief pulled me out of the very river I made deadly, and set a Dern boy's leg in the same hour she closed my side, and fed the wolves my own captains would have killed, and buried my enemies beside my own men because the ground doesn't care and she'd no strength for 2 graveyards. You did in one autumn alone with red hands, the one thing 3 years of my war could not do. You made a place where the 2 sides are not enemies. It's a byre and a graveyard and a cottage on a rise, and it's the only piece in this whole valley, and you built it without an army or a crown or my leave. My voice was not steady now. I did not try to make it so. I don't kneel to ask your forgiveness, Nessa. You owe me nothing, least of all that. I kneel because you've shown me the road I swore didn't exist, and I'd be a poor king and a poorer man if I climbed back on that horse and rode away from it. So take the moment. Take 100 of them. But when you're ready, I'd like to talk to you about ending my war, and I don't know how to begin it without you. She stared at me. The tallow stub guttered. Outside, one of the strays gave a low, uncertain sound, and my wolf answered it, gentled through my chest. You're mad, she said. You've a fever still, that's the wound talking. The wound, I said, is the clearest I've thought in 3 years. I will not pretend the peace came easy or fast, or that a king kneeling in a byre unmade a war by morning. It did not. But it began there in the straw, and it began with her, and everything that Ashgar and the Dern have between them now. The open ford, the shared crossings, the graves tended by both hands, began in a river widow's refusal to let anyone go back to the water. She made me wait until the boy could be moved without harm. That was her first condition before she'd hear a word of my counsel or my heralds. You end your war however kings end wars, she said. But that boy leaves this valley whole, back to his own people, under a flag your men will honor, or there's no talk at all. I gave her the flag. Havard rode it east himself, the Dern boy in the wagon, and came back 3 days later with a Dern herald beside him under the same gray cloth. Because the boy, it turned out, was no common footman but a nephew of one of the Dern River lords, and the River lords had spent 9 days believing my men had taken him, and were astonished past speech to be told instead that an Ashkar widow had set his leg, and an Ashkar king had sent him home. They came to talk because of that. Not because of my armies had never once brought them to talk in 3 years. They came because a woman had given a boy back whole, and a king had let her, and it made a crack in the certainty that we were only ever each other's drowning. Nessa was right, and I had been wrong the whole war. It was not the fords that could not be given up. It was the belief that the other side was only ever the river. She broke that belief with her red hands, one boy at a time, and I only had the crown to make it into a peace once she'd shown me it could be won. We made the terms at Harrow Ford. I would not make them anywhere else, and neither would she. She came to the talks, over Havard's grumbling and the council's outright horror, because I would not sit at that ford across from the Dern without the one person in the valley both sides had reason to trust. We stood on the very bank where she had dragged me out, the flood fallen now to a bright cold autumn stream, and we agreed a thing no herald in 3 years had got near. The fords open to both, the crossings shared, the dead of the war given a common ground, her graveyard, her high ground, formerly now, kept by both peoples, Dern and Ashkar side by side because the moon and the earth had never once cared which was which. And when it was signed, and the Dern lords had crossed back over the open ford as neighbors instead of enemies for the first time in 3 years, I turned to her on the bank, and I found I was afraid again, the good fear, the man's fear, the fear that has nothing to do with war. I have one more thing to set right, I said, and this one I'll not do by kneeling in a byre where no one can see. I'll do it in the light before every wolf and lord of Ashkar, so there's no lie left anywhere in it. But I'll not do it at all if you don't want it, Nessa. You've had enough men decide your life around you, the war that took your husband, the council that would use you, me that lied to you 9 days. I'll not be one more. So I'll ask, and the answer's yours, and if it's no, you'll still be the woman who ended my war, and you'll have my whole kingdom's honor for it till the end of your days, and I'll ride away and let you keep your ford in peace. I took a breath. My wolf chose you in the reeds before I ever woke to see your face. He's not moved from you since. In 3 years of a war I thought would never end, the only quiet I've known was your hand on my chest the hour I woke. I don't want to be a king who's only a king. You showed me how to be a man. I'd like to spend the rest of my life being one at your side if you'll have a war-worn fool who lied to you and knelt in your straw and can't seem to leave your ford. Be my Luna, Nessa, not for the crown, for the quiet, for the crossing you made where there was only drowning. Be my mate, and let me spend what I've got left honoring the woman who wouldn't let anyone go back to the river. She was quiet a long moment, there on the bank where she'd saved me, the cold stream bright between the two peoples she'd unmade a war for. The gray bitch with the torn ear sat at her heel. She'd never gone feral again, that one. She'd stayed. Nessa looked at the ford and at the graves on the high ground and at me. I stayed by this river, she said slowly, because I thought the most I could do was pull the drowned ones out and give them back to the ground. That was all I let myself hope for. That was the whole of it. Her eyes came up to mine, and for the first time since the byre they were not tired. And then the river gave me one who lived, and he turns out to be the whole war and the end of it, and a great lying fool who kneels in a woman's straw. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the country where a smile is born. You want an answer, Torin of Ashkar. More than I've wanted anything. She put her red, chapped hand flat against my chest, over the place where her hand had first quieted my war-mad wolf, and my whole heart lay down under it the way he had, the way the gray bitch had, the way everything broken in that valley had learned to lie down under those hands. Then don't tear your stitches, she said, kneeling to me again in front of all these lords, yes. They call it the widow's peace, in Ashkar and among the Dern both, though she has never once let anyone put her name to it and grows sharp with me when I try. She says she did nothing but refused to be sensible, refused to flee the flood, refused to let a Dern boy drown for his clan, refused to let a stranger she'd bled to save ride off and go back to his war. She says any fool with red hands and no better sense would have done the same. I have stopped arguing. I have learned that she is the only subject in my kingdom I cannot command, and I would not have it otherwise. A king should have one voice near him that owes him nothing and tells him only the truth, and mine is my Luna's, and it has never once led me wrong. We kept the cottage. She would not give it up, and I would not ask her to, though there is a great hall waiting in the north with a hearth 10 times its size. Each autumn, when the floods come and the Morro rises brown over Harrow Ford, we go back to it, the king and the Luna of Ashkar, in a one-room stone house on a rise, with the gray bitch grown old at the fire, and the hens on the byre roof, and the graves on the high ground kept green now by Dern hands and Ashkar hands together. And each autumn my Nessa rises before light and takes her hooked pole down to the shallows to see what the river has given in the night. Because the war is ended, but the river is still the river, and men still fall in it, on both sides, and she will not let a single one go back to it while she has hands to pull. I go down with her now. I have learned to search the drowned willows the way she taught me, slow and patient, reading the current for what it lets go. And every autumn morning, when the mist is on the water and she is wading out ahead of me with her sleeves pushed up and her dark hair bound in a strip of cloth, I remember that I woke once in her firelit cottage warm when I was meant to be dead, and understood by the warmth that a stranger had waded into a flood to pull a drowning man from the reeds, and that she never once knew, until the world came kneeling into her yard to tell her, that the man she'd saved was a king. She saved him anyway. That is the whole of who she is. She'd have done it the same if I'd been the poorest footman in the river. And that not the crown, not the peace, not the ford standing open where a war once drowned us. That is the thing I go back to the Morro each autumn to be grateful for. That once, when I was only a dying stranger the whole valley had left to the flood, a woman with red hands decided I was hers to keep alive. She still is, and I am still at the end of every argument only a man she pulled from a river, which is the finest thing I have ever been called, and the truest, and the one I mean to answer to long after they've forgotten I was ever a king.